Right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime for one of the Lunch and Learn sessions for TechShare Pro, first day of TechShare Pro. Very exciting. And this is what's the first rule of ARIA? So hi, I'm Nick Freer. I'm a accessibility consultant. Accessibility consultant at AbilityNet, and I'll be joined later on during the panel discussion by my colleague Claire Post. Yes. So just a brief one. I believe the session is being recorded. I think you've got live captions if you want them. I hope. There's I don't know the QA window, but there is a chat window and there's a Slido, I believe, as well. And the slides and recording will be made available to after the session. Just a brief outline of what we're going to be covering today. It's just a half-hour session, so it's going to be quite packed. So what is ARIA? Useful place to start. Introduce some rules and guidance related to ARIA. Some examples of bad practice, things that you shouldn't be doing. Some examples of good practice, do this. And it's resources and links and tools and so on. Then a brief panel discussion and Q&As, hopefully at the end, and summary and wrap up. I also thought it'd be worth having some disclaimers. So some of the slides contain code that is not correct on purpose. So don't use it, obviously, in production. Don't just copy and paste. That would be dangerous. And yes, these are based on real-world examples that we've seen in the wild. But we've sort of hidden, obviously, who the people are. Well, I should say that the code snippets do have smart quotes, so they wouldn't work anyway straight off. You'd have to fix the quotes before you do anything else. Anyway, yes, so first of all, what is ARIA? It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and I've highlighted the last word applications because originally when it was first developed as a standard, the first published version was in 2014, I believe. It filled a gap. This was before HTML5. Websites were becoming more and more interactive and sophisticated, more and more JavaScript, more and more sort of Ajax and complex user interfaces. And basically, there wasn't enough in the HTML spec to meet all the needs in terms of accessibility. So ARIA was developed to meet that need, mostly for sort of the more sophisticated application end of the web, as opposed to plain sort of content-driven sites. So it's a technical specification. It was first published, like I say, by the World Wide Web Consortium in 2014. It can be described as sort of syntactic sugar, sort of sprinkled over the top of a markup language like HTML or SVG. It's also been described, I've seen it being described as spackle, not rebar. That's a US reference. I believe spackle is like our polyfiller in the UK or Europe, and rebar is it's the reinforcement, the steel reinforcement found in concrete. So it's saying that it's polyfiller. It's something to patch things up. It's it's not the foundation. So the foundation is still your host language, which would be HTML or SVG. Or a mixture of the two, as we often see now. And often ARIA relies on JavaScript as well, and we'll come to a bit of that as well. There are currently 3 versions of ARIA that you can look at. 1.1, which was published at the end of 2017, is a completed recommendation, so that's stable. You can just use that, no problem. I think I would go for ARIA 1.2 at the moment. That is what the Worldwide Consortium classes as a candidate recommendation as of December last year. I think they were going to make it finalised towards the end of this year. Obviously, we're almost at the end of the year. And then we've got 1.3, which you're welcome to view, but I'd be careful about using it in production because it won't be as widely supported in browsers and other user agents and assistive technologies. So so what's the first rule of ARIA? That's obviously given the name to this presentation, this session. So it is to not use ARIA. In more detail, there's a document the World Wide Web Consortium has published called Using ARIA, and it has some rules, and it says that if you can use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantics and behavior that you require that's already built in, instead of repurposing an element and adding a role, state or property to make it accessible, then do so. So basically saying that you should minimize your use of ARIA. You should really question whether you need it before you launch in. And that is really the in a way, the biggest takeaway I've got you for you today, really. Yes, like I say, that's from a document using ARIA for the World Wide Web Consortium. There's a link in the slides. Or you can just search for the phrase using ARIA, you should be able to find it. There are 4 other rules, which I'll only run through briefly because they are all important. We'll see them in the examples. But but basically, don't change native semantics of a tag. So an HTML element, unless you really have to. All ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. So if you develop a combo box, then the idea is you make that accessible with a keyboard. Don't hide things that should be focusable using role equals presentation or ARIA hidden equals true, and all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So those are the rules that are out there. Yes. So I'm just repeating what other people have said. This isn't anything that's actually new. There's also 2 principles. There's a document called the Authoring Practices Guide, which I'll refer to again, and there's a read me first section there, which talks about a role being a promise. So a role is a promise, which means that it sets up some expectations about behavior, about what keyboard shortcuts will work, and about how something will behave. And also that principle 2, ARIA can both cloak and enhance. So it's a powerful, it's quite powerful, and it is it can cause problems. It can make things, in fact make things less accessible rather than more accessible. And in that sort of vein, the latest version of the WebAIM Million report, which I think was from last year now, is showing an increase in the use of ARIA attributes. So they found over 60 million ARIA attributes across a million. Is that a million pages or a million sites? I think it's a million home pages. So it comes to 60 per page on average. That's an awful lot, really. And homepage with ARIA now account for about 70%. Sorry, they average more. They average more errors than those without ARIA. So there is a correlation between the increased use of ARIA and more errors. Not necessarily, there's not necessarily causation, because those tend to be pages which are more complex anyway and have more tags and things generally. But anyway, 33% of ARIA menus introduced some sort of barrier. So the lack of, let's say, menu markup or interactions. And I'll touch on menus actually briefly as well in a minute. role, and on average there were 2.5 buttons produced using ARIA on each homepage on average. That's from the Web A1,000,000. Also, just to, I suppose, to give some context, this was a tweet that one of my colleagues found recently, and the caption on this, on the right, we've got an image of two guys trying to produce a really dodgy, wonky wall of bricks. All the bricks sorts of at different angles, higgledy-piggledy different angles, and it's captioned, "We will just keep using ARIA," and that was Mark Steadman posted on Twitter at the start of November, which sort of is the sort of approach that it seems that people take sometimes. You get the impression that people are just, we'll just keep on using it and sort of hope for the best. There's also a blog post recently talking about a specific attribute, ARIA label, as being a code smell. That is, it's sort of a sign that you should look more carefully at a page if you come across this attribute, because it's often misused, as we will see in some of the examples. Yes, that's just a bit of context for you there. I'm going to run at great pace through some of these examples quickly. So the first example I've got just shows you example of not using ARIA unless you really have to. So someone's taken a plain div element and added role equals button, tab index equals 0, and ARIA label equals submit, which is all well and good, but actually it would be far better just to use a native button, because that's got slightly better native behavior. It's actually more readable, for you as a developer or a designer. It's actually more readable and maintainable to just use a plain button, because it shouts out what it actually is there, as opposed to being a div that's masquerading as a button. Another example I've got here that I came across, which I thought was great or really awful. So in this case, we've got 3 different attributes spread across 3 nested divs. So on the outside, you've got the ARIA label, which has the name in it. In the middle, we've got the role equals button, and then in the inner div, we've got the tab index equals 0, which is supposed to make the button focusable. And again, the best approach would just be to use native button, but if you must use a div, then put all those on the same element. So the label, if you've got a generic element like a div, it actually doesn't support ARIA label by default. You have to marry it with a role equals something to make it make sense. So that's where that one comes in. I've also seen this myself. I've seen it several times. Because the ARIA label is hidden, I think people think that somehow they therefore can add more and more details. So this is quite a long ARIA label saying, click the button to send the registration and create an account, and then the actual content of the button just said submit. Well, in this case, you can get rid of the click and the button and all these bits and just have a single, a couple of words. So whether it be register, submit, register account, create account, whatever it would be, but just keep it brief, and don't use ARIA label as an excuse for a really long accessible name, because it just adds more bloat and confusion. And just briefly, this was from one of my colleagues, where they come across a site which had a container element, basically for the whole page, was turned into a button and made focusable, and then obviously it contained links and your headers, navigation, all sorts of content. So it had a huge accessible name, and it was also just would cause lots of confusion, multiple focus issues and so on. You can use tab index equals -1 if you want to set focus to something, but don't use tab index equals 0 unless you really mean that it should be something interactive. So that's a few of the examples I had of bad practice. And good practice, actually, what I'm looking at, I'm going to show you is just some plain HTML. So these are things that are part of HTML5, which you may or may not be aware of, and they can be handy. So if you want an accordion, just a simple accordion, you can actually do it without using any JavaScript at all. Use a details element with a summary inside, which acts in the same manner as a button and expands and reveals some content, which is put inside the details there. So that gives you behavior for free. It's keyboard accessible, and it's accessible to people using screen readers and so on for free. It can be styled. If you must do your own functionality, then you would need to use ARIA expanded equals true false to show the state of the accordion or the disclosure. So that's just one example of using plain HTML in place of ARIA. We can talk about other sort of good practices, but other good examples. But basically, the thing to do is to keep up with the HTML5 spec. That's one of my first suggestions. Read the actual manual for ARIA. Don't just make assumptions. There's a very good website there called the Authoring Practices Guide, which is full of lots of examples of different sorts of combo boxes, different sorts of accordions, all sorts of different form widgets, interactive controls which have been built using ARIA, and that will be that's a really good source of information, and it tells you how things should behave in terms of keyboard navigation. So it tells you what the expectations would be for things like a combo box, what keys you would use to navigate down the list box part and so on. I'm going to come on to this briefly in a minute. Translations, there aren't that many of them, and you need to test your code, your markup and your apps that contain ARIA as you would with anything with a keyboard. Just briefly, something I came across recently. There's a page that the World Wide Web Consortium maintains of all their translations, of all their reports, including their specifications. And WCAG 2.0 appears to be the most widely translated into 18 different languages, including things like Chinese, Russian, Spanish. The only obvious missing one I could see was Arabic. That one didn't have Arabic. WCAG 2.1 is still pretty good. It still has 11 translations. It's not too bad. But if you look at ARIA 1.0 and 1.1, those are right down towards the bottom of the graph, with only 2 and 1 translations, respectively. And obviously, ARIA 1.2, which is about to, which is about to be finalised, doesn't have any translations yet. So I think this is a real gap, and really holds people back, because there's lots of detail and subtlety to using ARIA, which would be missed if you have to read in language you're not familiar with. And there's a lot that we didn't have time for, but I'll skip over this briefly to some useful resources. And excuse me. And we'll go on to the panel discussion. Just trying to slow things down there. Do we have questions, and do we have any questions from other people? Claire, do you have anything?
At the moment, we haven't got any questions, but if anybody does have a burning question for Nick particularly, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A, and it's under Slido in your on my screen. It's on the right. And I think Nick has obviously provided some useful resources. I think from obviously ARIA's can be quite complicated. But I think in terms of a question for you, Nick, what do you think can be done to reduce misuse of ARIA? Because I think that is something that obviously anybody working in accessibility probably sees quite a lot.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I think it all comes down to education and giving developers and designers the space to actually learn about the about ARIA properly and how to use it, where to use it, and where not to use it. So I think education is the big thing, and just giving people time. I suppose the fact that there are newer versions of ARIA coming out, makes things a bit more complicated for people, and means that people perhaps perhaps get a bit confused. So that's it. And also translations. I mean, as I touched on there, I think having more translations to different languages, so people could read in their own language or in a language they're more familiar with, and not having to rely just on English, then that would help. And I mean, just think for you perhaps, what do you think are the most common misconceptions about ARIA? What things have you come across?
Yeah. I think ARIA is, and as you were saying about education and translation, it can be one of those things that looks overwhelming when you first look at it if you've got no experience of it. I think one of the misconceptions that I find a lot working in accessibility with people who don't have experience with it is the belief that ARIA somehow bestows magical properties on your site and makes it accessible just because you've used ARIA.
Yes.
So I think that's one thing that I seem to find a lot of. And as I think you mentioned earlier, it's better actually not to use ARIA than to use bad ARIA, as that can kind of just make the site even less accessible. Things like I've experienced in previous roles, kind of where somebody had obviously learned about ARIA and decided that they were going to use it for every single thing on their entire page. Things like using a role of a button on an HTML button element, which is obviously slightly pointless, but also having ARIA labels on everything, which for a speech screen reader user, I'm sure would have been pretty overwhelming. So I think that's probably one of the key things, but also that, if you use ARIA as a replacement for normal HTML, obviously, as we say, rule one of ARIA is don't use ARIA, but obviously sometimes you do have to. But if you can use HTML, that gives you so much more of the behavior and the accessibility built in, essentially. So don't go to ARIA unless you don't have a choice, I think, is probably another quote. And also, I think the last point on that is people kind of making up their own ARIA roles, etc. So I think one thing that, as we say, keeping names out to protect the guilty, but we say a large supermarket website had a role equals icon, which is obviously not actually a role in ARIA. So that was probably just very confusing to anybody who was using that site and was making use of features impacted in ARIA. So there are definitely a few misconceptions, but I think absolutely education and translation definitely is a big plus. We have had a couple of questions come in.
One asks, so why does the panel think so many developers took ARIA at the page? Yes, I mean, I don't know. I think, as we say, I think it comes down to education. It comes down to a misunderstanding of what is actually what ARIA is for. Yes. I mean, it in a way, I suppose it's a bit of a I suppose in a way it's a bit of a mystery for me, because I obviously have quite a lot of understanding of what it is for. So, but yes, it is a strange phenomenon. Yes, yeah.
I think certainly from my own experience with developers, they are told about ARIA, but not kind of given as much education into its kind of proper use. They think it's something that, again, it's that kind of, if you put ARIA on it, it will mystically transform into an accessible website.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I think, again, it's kind of people being told about ARIA, but without the kind of proper background as to how to use it.
Yes, yes.
I think we've had a question from Helen about the slides, and yes, I think all the slides will be available from the site, not immediately, but in the next couple of days, I believe.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you. Yes, they will be available.
And I think the one other question, which I think will probably be a very quick one, from Melanie, asking about
live regions. Yes, thank you. That is a good question, which I didn't really touch upon. So, I mean, that is, for people who don't know, live regions are basically a way of some text being read out by a screen reader without being focused. So normally it's the text that is focused by the screen reader that's being read out. So this is a way of making an announcement, and they are. I mean, that is that's an appropriate use of ARIA. You shouldn't use them that often. And you shouldn't if you use them if you have something like a progress bar, then the live region shouldn't be updated too frequently, because that would be overwhelming. But I mean, putting role equals status, or role equals alert, role equals log, those are all turn elements into live regions, and that's useful. I think the other thing to say is that also generally you have to have the live region on the page either at page load or sort of soon afterwards, and well before you add some content. People often sort of add a live region with the content in at the same time. That's something I've seen again, and so I expect it to be written, to be read out. But it needs to be added. The live region needs to be added first, empty, and then add the content. At least a few seconds later, to give the system a time to sort itself out, and then things will be announced. Does that help? On live regions, I suppose it says that obviously they can be assertive and they can be polite, and it's whether you which you choose. You have to be a bit careful to that you don't use assertive too often. I think I'll stop rambling there because it's plenty.
We're coming up to time, so I think we've rammed a lot into that half an hour. But I'll just leave you to close off the session.
Yes. We thank you everybody for listening in. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. It was quite a brief overview, and not that much time for some questions and discussions.